The SS officer lay half-twisted in the mud, one gloved hand clawing at the torn fabric around his thigh, the other stretching toward the American medic as if rank and desperation could still command obedience. Blood seeped through the black wool of his uniform and pooled beneath him in the cold spring dirt. Smoke drifted low across the courtyard in thin gray ribbons. Somewhere beyond the walls, a machine gun fired a short, ugly burst, then fell silent. The fighting was almost over. The camp had been taken. The screaming had not. "Medic!" the German shouted, his voice trembling with pain and panic. "Morphine! Help me! Doctor!" The American medic stopped only a few feet away. He was young, filthy, hollow-eyed, his helmet marked with a red cross now dulled by dust and soot. A canvas medical bag hung against his side, heavy with bandages, sulfa packets, plasma, tourniquets, and a few precious syrettes of morphine. Under ordinary conditions, his duty was simple. A wounded man was a wounded man. American, German, it did not matter. That was the rule. That was what separated a medic from a killer. That was the line civilized armies were supposed to recognize even in the middle of war. But nothing in that courtyard was ordinary. The medic looked down at the SS officer for one long second. Then he slowly turned his head toward the rows of wooden barracks behind the wire. Men who barely looked human were collapsing in the dirt. Others were too weak to stand. Faces like skulls stared back from behind striped rags and sunken eyes. The smell in the air was not just smoke. It was rot, disease, excrement, burned flesh, starvation, death that had settled into the ground itself and stained everything it touched. The German officer reached for him again, his voice now higher, stripped of command. "Please! Morphine!" The medic did not kneel. He did not open his bag. He did not even answer. He stepped around the bleeding SS man and kept walking toward the prisoners. In that one silent act of refusal, something larger than battlefield medicine took place. The rules the SS officer thought he could still invoke collided with the reality of what the Americans had just uncovered. To understand why an American medic, a man trained to save life wherever he found it, could look at a wounded enemy begging for relief and walk away without a word, you have to go back before the gates swung open, before the firing died down, before the first stunned American soldiers saw what was hidden behind the walls of Dachau. By the spring of 1945, American medics had already seen more suffering than most human beings could imagine. They had crawled through the hedgerows of Normandy under mortar fire carrying plasma bottles in their teeth. They had stumbled through the Hurtgen forest with mud sucking at their boots while artillery ripped apart the trees overhead. They had worked through the frozen nightmare of the Ardennes, treating shattered limbs, chest wounds, and boys calling for their mothers in the snow. The men with red crosses on their helmets were not soft. They were among the bravest men in the United States Army. They crossed open ground without rifles. They ran toward screams instead of away from them. They entered places even armed infantry hesitated to enter. And when the firing stopped, they treated whoever was dying in front of them. That mattered. It mattered because American medics believed in rules. They believed that war, brutal as it was, still had lines civilized men recognized. Once an enemy dropped his weapon and lay bleeding in the mud, he became a patient. American medics bandaged Wehrmacht prisoners. They gave morphine to enemy soldiers in collapsed farmhouses. They stopped hemorrhaging for men who had been trying to kill them only minutes earlier. They did it because that was the code. It was a way of proving, to themselves as much as anyone else, that they were not the thing they were fighting. In the chaos of war, that moral discipline mattered almost as much as the medicine. But as American divisions drove deeper into Germany, rumors began to circulate through the columns. Strange places, prison compounds, labor camps, trains full of bodies, civilians whispering and refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The stories were so monstrous that many soldiers assumed they had to be exaggerated. Every war breeds rumor. Every front line invents horrors worse than the last. But the farther east the Americans pushed, the more those whispers stopped sounding like battlefield gossip and started sounding like warnings. Then came April 1945, and with it the approach to Dachau. The men moving toward the camp were not green recruits. They were veterans of hard fighting, men from units like the 42nd Rainbow Division and the 45th Infantry Division, officers and enlisted men who had crossed France, smashed through Germany, and watched friends die by the roadside. They thought they understood what evil looked like. They had seen towns shelled to pieces. They had seen civilians torn apart by total war. They had seen what artillery did to flesh and what machine guns did to boys barely old enough to shave. But what waited near Dachau belonged to a different category of human crime. They smelled it before they saw it. There was a sweetness in the air, sickly and unnatural, the kind of odor that clings to the back of the throat and makes the stomach tighten before the mind has even understood why. Then they found the train. The boxcars stood on the tracks outside the camp, silent beneath the gray sky, as if they had simply been abandoned in haste. American soldiers slid open the wooden doors and discovered not cargo, not troops, not supplies, but human bodies, stacked in impossible numbers. Men reduced to sticks and bone, corpses in striped uniforms, corpses in civilian clothes, bodies with mouths open as though the last thing they had done on earth was beg for air. Some soldiers stared in silence, some cursed, some vomited in the grass. Others wept openly, not from fear, but from a rage so deep it emptied them. And that was only outside the gates. When the Americans entered the camp itself, the scale of the nightmare widened beyond comprehension. Barracks packed with skeletal prisoners, men too weak to rise, disease everywhere, latrines overflowing, bodies unburied, eyes staring from faces so hollow they looked carved out of wax. Survivors reached toward the Americans not with celebration, but with the slow, stunned motions of people who had not yet decided whether this was real or another cruelty. The liberators had brought rifles, tanks, and field medicine. What they found required an entirely different kind of strength. For the American medical corpsmen, the scene was overwhelming from the first second. They were trained to stabilize casualties in combat zones, to run aid stations, to sort wounds under pressure. But Dachau was not a normal battlefield. It was a man-made collapse of humanity. Typhus, dysentery, starvation, exposure, advanced dehydration, men whose bodies had been reduced so far that even food had to be given with care, or it could kill them. Every step the medics took confronted them with choices no training manual had prepared them to make. There were too many dying, too little time, too few supplies, too much evil packed into one place. They moved from barrack to barrack in a state somewhere between discipline and shock. One medic knelt beside a prisoner who weighed less than a child and tried to lift his head gently enough that the man would not choke on the water cup pressed to his lips. Another cut away infected rags that had once been clothing. Another checked pulses so faint they were almost imaginary. Some men could be saved if treated at once. Others were already too far gone, and all around them, the survivors kept trying to touch American sleeves and hands, as if they needed the reassurance of solid cloth and living skin to believe that the ordeal had truly ended. In the middle of that chaos, the medics had to work as medics always worked. They had to classify, prioritize, decide. That process had a name every corpsman knew: triage. It sounds cold when spoken aloud. It is supposed to. Triage is not sentiment. Triage is arithmetic performed under the pressure of death. It means asking where limited time, limited manpower, and limited medicine can do the most good. In ordinary combat, those decisions are already brutal. At Dachau, they became unbearable. And then, there were the guards. Not all of them had escaped. Some had tried to fight when the Americans approached. Some had thrown down their weapons the moment armed infantry burst into the compound. Some were wounded in the confusion, hit by rifle fire, by ricochets, by the chaos that erupts when enraged liberators encounter men who have spent years tormenting the helpless. These were not anonymous frontline soldiers swept up by a collapsing front. Many belonged to the SS, the organization that had turned camps like Dachau into instruments of degradation and death. Even wounded, some still carried themselves with the brittle arrogance of men who had long believed they were untouchable. That arrogance did not vanish simply because the black uniforms were torn and bleeding. Several of the surviving guards tried to invoke rules. Rules. That was the breathtaking obscenity of it. Men serving a regime that had violated every principle of civilized conduct suddenly wanted the protection of civilized conduct for themselves. They wanted doctors, bandages, water, morphine. They wanted the benefits of order after years spent enforcing organized cruelty. They wanted American mercy to arrive on command, clean and immediate, as though the world behind the wire did not exist. Under different circumstances, American medics might have given it. That is what makes the moment so powerful. The refusal did not come from ignorance of duty. It came from a deeper confrontation with reality. American medics knew exactly what duty required on an ordinary battlefield, but Dachau was not ordinary. Dachau was the breaking point. The first obligation in front of them was not to the comfort of the perpetrators. It was to the survival of the victims. Every bandage wrapped around an SS man was a bandage not wrapped around a prisoner collapsing from typhus. Every drop of plasma given to a camp guard was plasma denied to a man who had been starved for months. Every syringe of morphine used on an officer in black was relief taken away from one of the camp's victims. So the medics looked at the scene around them and made their choice. They went to the prisoners first. They ran into the barracks. They cut away filthy clothing. They cleaned wounds that had festered untreated for weeks. They tried to lower fevers. They improvised treatment areas wherever they could. They called for more stretchers, more plasma, more sulfa, more water, more everything. Their hands did not stop moving. Their boots were soaked in mud, blood, and the runoff of human misery. They worked in conditions that would have broken lesser men. And while they worked, the wounded SS guards waited. That was what many of the guards could not understand. Waiting was for other people. Pain was for other people. Fear was for the prisoners, not for the men who had commanded them. Yet now, the balance had flipped with brutal finality. The Americans did not salute them. They did not rush to them. They did not respond to rank. They responded to need. And in that place, among those barracks, the greatest need belonged to the victims. One wounded SS officer, his leg mangled and his authority gone, kept calling for morphine as the medics moved past him. He tried anger first, then indignation, then legal language, then begging. He reminded them he was wounded. He reminded them he was an officer. He reminded them, absurdly, that under the rules of war, he was entitled to treatment. That was the world he still believed he occupied. A world in which title and status could still force reality to yield. An American medic heard every word. He had spent the previous hour helping carry a prisoner who weighed less than a child. He had knelt beside a dying man whose body had been eaten alive by disease and starvation. He had looked into barracks where dozens lay stacked on bunks like firewood, too weak even to lift their heads. He had seen men cry over a sip of clean water. He had watched survivors look at a bandage as if it were a miracle. The SS officer's appeal did not land in an abstract courtroom of wartime ethics. It landed in that reality. It landed amid the smell, the barracks, the train, the corpses, the survivors licking cracked lips for a mouthful of life. So when the officer begged for morphine, the medic made his decision, without drama. He kept walking. That was the moment. Not a shouted threat, not a speech, not a theatrical act of revenge. Something colder than that. Something cleaner. The man with the red cross simply refused to spend his mercy where it did not belong. The officer called after him again, this time no longer sounding like a commander. The edge was gone from his voice. All that remained was pain and disbelief. He could not understand how the order of his world had vanished so completely. For years, men like him had lived above consequence. They had enforced suffering downward and expected obedience upward. Even in defeat, he had assumed his uniform still meant something. At Dachau, in front of American medics, it meant the opposite. The refusal was not random cruelty. It was triage, sharpened by moral clarity. The Americans were not in that camp to protect the comfort of the men who had built it. They were there to save whoever could still be saved from the catastrophe the SS had engineered. And that meant the prisoners came first. Always first. The walking skeleton in the barracks came first. The fevered survivor shivering under a lice-ridden blanket came first. The man coughing blood on the dirt floor came first. The half-conscious inmate with hollow eyes and a pulse barely hanging on came first. The child-sized body of a grown man wasting away from starvation came first. The SS officer in black, still alive and still demanding relief, did not. As the hours passed, the camp changed. More American soldiers entered and saw with their own eyes what words could never fully explain. More prisoners were moved. More field stations were improvised. More corpsmen arrived. Doctors began trying to create some kind of system inside complete collapse. Some guards were taken away under armed escort. Others lay where they had fallen, their requests fading into the larger storm of suffering around them. The war had not yet ended, but inside Dachau, something final had already happened. The illusion of SS superiority had collapsed into the dirt. For many American soldiers, liberation did not feel like triumph in the ordinary sense. There was no clean celebratory release in that place. There was too much filth, too much grief, too much evidence of organized evil. Men who had endured artillery and machine gun fire found themselves stunned into silence by the sight of starving prisoners reaching for them with trembling hands. Some infantrymen looked at the surviving guards and saw not soldiers but butchers. Some medics looked at their own bags of medicine and understood in a way they never had before that supplies were not just medical resources. In that camp, they were moral choices. This is the part history often compresses too quickly. People say the camp was liberated. That is true. But liberation was not a single gate opening. It was thousands of decisions made in the minutes and hours after the Americans entered. Who gets lifted first? Who gets water first? Who gets carried out of the barracks? Who receives the plasma? Which feverish body is wrapped in the last clean blanket? Which patient is treated immediately? Which one must wait? At Dachau, those decisions all took place under the shadow of one unbearable truth. Many of the men now pleading for help had spent years denying help to everyone else. The medics could not fix everything. No one could. They could not undo months of starvation in a single day. They could not reverse typhus with willpower alone. They could not restore the dead. What they could do was choose where to stand. And they stood with the prisoners. That is why the image of the wounded SS officer begging for morphine matters so much. It captures the final collapse of a particular kind of arrogance. The SS had built an entire worldview around power, hierarchy, racial hatred, and the belief that human worth could be determined by force. They had spent years deciding who deserved food, water, medicine, and life itself. Then, in the end, one of their own lay in the mud pleading for relief from an American medic and discovered that the world no longer revolved around his pain. The victims came first, now. The men he had been taught to regard as disposable came first. The entire moral order had turned against him. Eventually, after the first desperate wave of life-saving work on the prisoners had been done, some of the surviving guards did receive rough medical attention. But even then, there was no ceremony, no urgency born of respect, no softness in the way it was given. The Americans were not there to comfort them. They were there to keep enough order for justice to move forward. A guard might be bandaged just enough not to bleed out. A wound might be wrapped without a word. A man might be loaded onto transport not as an officer, not as an elite, but as a defeated prisoner stripped of every illusion he had carried into that courtyard. For the medics, the day did not end. When the immediate crisis passed, men who had spent the war saving the wounded now carried images into the rest of their lives that medicine could not erase. The train, the barracks, the smell, the hands reaching through the wire, the contrast between the prisoner's desperate gratitude and the guard's bewildered entitlement. Those memories hardened into something deeper than anger. They became a permanent answer to anyone who later tried to speak of the camps in abstract terms. For the medics who were there was nothing abstract about it. People often imagine battlefield medicine as a simple contest between life and death. But for the men who walked through Dachau, it became a test of something even more difficult. How to preserve your humanity after witnessing the deliberate destruction of humanity on an industrial scale. These were not men eager to become executioners. They were medics. They had crossed battlefields to save lives under fire. They had treated enemy wounded before. They understood duty, but duty is not blindness, and compassion is not the same thing as moral amnesia. That is what the wounded SS officer begging for morphine could never understand. He thought pain alone made him equal to the men around him. He thought bleeding in the mud erased the years of cruelty behind the wire. He thought his suffering, in that instant, should command the same urgency as the suffering of the prisoners he and his fellow guards had helped break. The Americans standing in that camp knew better. Pain was not a magic absolution. A wound was not innocence. And a desperate plea did not erase what the prisoners had endured. The medics had reached a point where battlefield neutrality could no longer be understood as simple symmetry between victim and perpetrator. They were still medics. They still believed in saving life. But saving life at Dachau meant making hard distinctions. It meant recognizing that one man's plea for morphine stood against thousands of men whose bodies had been reduced to shadows. It meant accepting that rehumanizing the camp began by refusing to place the men in black above the people they had tried to erase. That was not the abandonment of morality. In its own terrible way, it was morality made concrete under impossible conditions. And so the answer to the title is both simple and devastating. What did the American medics do when a wounded SS officer begged for morphine? They chose the victims. They chose the survivors gasping in the barracks. They chose the men who had been starved, beaten, infected, and worked toward death. They chose to spend their strength, their supplies, their hands, and their medicine on the people who had been denied everything. And in doing so, they delivered one of the harshest judgments imaginable, not with a rifle shot, not with a courtroom sentence, but with a refusal so quiet and so devastating that it reduced a man of the SS to just another defeated body in the mud, no more important than the pain he had helped would be studied through photographs, testimonies, military records, and trials. Historians would debate decisions, reconstruct timelines, and weigh the moral meaning of what the liberators found. But for the Americans who stood there in the mud with medical bags slung over their shoulders, the truth had arrived before the analysis. It arrived through smell, sight, touch, and shock. It arrived in the form of bodies stacked in boxcars and survivors collapsing at their feet. It arrived in the obscene sound of a wounded SS officer demanding relief from the very men now trying to save the people his system had destroyed. Some moments in history do not require embellishment, because reality itself is already unbearable. This was one of them. And perhaps that is why the scene remains so powerful. It distills the final collapse of Nazi arrogance into one stark image. A man who had once stood on the side of organized terror, now helpless, now begging, now forced to discover that the world would not stop for him anymore. Across from him stood an American medic, exhausted, filthy, carrying the last measures of relief he could offer in a place overflowing with pain. The medic's choice was not glamorous. It was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was harder than that. It was disciplined. It was quiet. It was a refusal, rooted not in chaos, but in clarity. In war, men often reveal who they are when power leaves their hands. At Dachau, the SS guards revealed themselves in their pleas, their excuses, their sudden attachment to rules they had never honored. The American medics revealed themselves in a different way. They revealed that even in the ruins of civilization, they still understood what had to come first. Not rank, not uniforms, not the comfort of the defeated. The suffering of the innocent inflict on others. That is why the moment matters. It was bigger than one syringe of morphine, bigger than one officer, bigger than one camp courtyard. It was the collision between two worlds. On one side stood the men of the SS, who had built their lives on hierarchy, cruelty, racial hatred, and the belief that human worth could be decided by power. On the other stood exhausted American medics, carrying limited supplies through one of the darkest places on Earth, forced to decide in real time what mercy still meant. Their answer was not sentimental. It was not abstract. It was brutally concrete. Mercy belonged first to the innocent. Relief belonged first to the broken. Compassion belonged first to the people who had been denied it for far too long. The wounded officer's plea for morphine revealed more than his pain. It revealed the final bankruptcy of the system he served. Even then, even there, he still expected to be treated as someone whose comfort mattered. But the camp behind him answered that assumption more powerfully than any American ever needed to. The dead answered it. The train answered it. The barracks answered it. The survivors answered it, with every skeletal face that turned toward the men wearing red crosses on their helmets. The American medics did not need a speech. They had already seen enough. And that is why one of the most powerful acts at Dachau was not what they said to the wounded SS. It was what they did not do. They did not rush to ease the pain of the men who had overseen hell. They did not place the perpetrators ahead of the victims. They did not confuse procedure with justice. They went where their conscience, their duty, and the reality of that camp demanded they go. They went to the prisoners first. In the years after the war, the liberation of the camps came first. The living remnants of the camp came first. The broken men behind the wire came first. That choice did not erase the horror. Nothing could. But it marked the beginning of an answer. The gates had opened. The lies had ended. The masks had fallen. And in the middle of that shattered world, with smoke still hanging over the courtyard and the stench of death still clinging to the air, American medics carried out one of the most severe moral judgments of the war without raising their voices. They simply turned away from the men who had ruled through cruelty and walked toward the people who still had a chance to live. They chose the prisoners first. And in that choice, the entire mythology of the so-called master race died in the mud.